I think when we talk about the precautionary principle, we have to be very careful to think not only about the risks of developing such and such a technology, but also the risks of not developing it. And the situation in relation to aging is a very clear one in that regard. It's all very well and perfectly legitimate and honourable to identify potential problems that might be created as a result of medically defeating aging. And I'm all for that. What I'm not all for is the idea of identifying those problems and then switching one's brain off and not trying to quantify the severity of those problems, even the worst case severity of them, and to, actually compare that severity with the severity of the problem we have today that we would be solving, namely all of the suffering and disability and disease and death that goes on as a result of aging. Most people are willing to say that they don't want this to happen because they don't know how we would pay the pensions, or they don't know where we would put all the people, or whatever. Just because they don't know, even if none of us know, that's absolutely no legitimate reason not to develop these technologies. Because humanity of the future may well know how to deal with those problems. And yes, you can say they may well not know, but the fact is it's up to them. The precautionary principle in this case, therefore, is to guard against the possibility that humanity of the future will look back at us and blame us for condemning them to an unnecessarily early and unnecessarily painful and miserable old age and death, just because we were so clever, or we thought we were, that we thought we knew what the future was going to be like, and that it would be better off for the future of humanity if they didn't have these technologies. That's the risk that I don't want to take. Maxmore's terminology, the proactionary principle, is really pretty much identical to my description of the precautionary principle in terms of the risks of not acting. In other words, you could use two different words, but really it's all about the risks of a particular course of action. And it seems to me that one could describe either of them as the precautionary principle. But I like the phrase proactionary principle as well. It's not exactly an unfamiliar situation that one has to actually act in order to minimize some particular risk, or to minimize some particular risk for somebody else. In this case, the risk is bigger than it is for anything else, because we're talking about such a lot of suffering and such a lot of deaths. People often point out that what works in mice doesn't necessarily work for humans. And of course that's true. But that's nothing special about aging. That's true for the whole of medicine. And yet, everyone still agrees that it makes very good sense to develop drugs and other therapies in mice first. Ultimately, the reason it makes sense is because, yes, there are plenty of differences between mice and humans, but there are also plenty of similarities. So if something works in mice, there may still be plenty of work to do to make it work in humans, to actually translate that into humans. But still, if it doesn't work in mice, there's probably not much chance that it'll ever work in humans. So still it makes sense to start with mice. You know you're going in broadly the right direction if you've got something that works well in mice. In some cases it's possible for a given therapy, and again here I'm not just talking about therapies for age-related problems, to go straight from mice to clinical trials without actually taking the trouble to look at intermediate organisms like dogs or chimpanzees, for example. In other cases, there may be reasons to believe that mice are particularly poor models of the human disease, and therefore that even though the thing works well in mice, it's important to look at other species that are better models, that are maybe less convenient because, let's say, they live longer or they're just more expensive, but nevertheless they're more similar to humans before going to the actual clinical trials. So it's absolutely a case-by-case thing.